Good afternoon. This is Amy Hollick-Dunn from the Alumni Association. We'll begin in about a minute. Patty, are you on the line?
I am.
Okay. So we'll get going in just a couple of minutes. So it's noon. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for taking time to participate in our webinar, How Trying to Be Perfect Can Be No Good at All, with Professor Patricia Martin DiBartolo, class of 1989. We're proud to bring you today's session as a part of our ongoing series of webinars called Smith Women Connect. These online programs draw on the talents and expertise of alumni and focus on a range of topics from careers and wellness to business and personal finance. As we schedule future webinars, you can find a list on the Alumni Association's website under the Events button. I want to remind you, too, that the Alumni Association is your link to Smith, and in addition to online programs like this one, we offer a host of other services, including professional networking events, reunion, and career counseling that connect you and your fellow alumni to the intellectual life of Smith. You can find specific information on our website, alumni.smith.edu. Just a few quick housekeeping details before we begin. Our program will last about an hour. All callers are muted, and you can submit questions either by typing them into the questions box at the lower right of the screen or by raising your hand. Patty will answer questions at the end of the webinar. I will send the presentation slides as PDF to all participants after the webinar. Enjoy today's session, and feel free to send your feedback or ideas for future webinars to aascevents@smith.edu. And a quick introduction. Patty Martin DiBartolo, 89, joined the Smith faculty in 1995. She received a PhD in clinical psychology from the State University of New York at Albany in 1996. She is currently professor and chair of psychology, teaching in the areas of child clinical psychology, advanced research methods, and child and adolescent anxiety disorders. Patty was the recipient of Smith's Sherard Prize for Distinguished Teaching in 2008. Her research investigates the phenomenology, of perfectionism and its clinical correlations, especially anxiety, in both adult and youth samples. She has published over 30 articles and chapters on these topics, co-editing the volume Social Anxiety, Clinical Development and Social Perspectives, and co-authored a therapist's guide and accompanying client workbook titled Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Social Phobia in Adolescents, Stand Up, Speak Out. Welcome, Professor DiBartolo.
Thank you so much. I am just wondering, as I'm looking to advance our slides, perhaps Amy, you could, oh, there we go.
There we go. Okay.
Thank you. I hope you'll all bear with me a moment. I've never done a webinar before, so I will guarantee you I will not be perfect today. So what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about my areas of research in perfectionism, and things have really advanced in the past 20 or so years since I've started some of this work, in fact, as an undergraduate here at Smith College. So here are the objectives for today, is to talk to you a little bit about what we now understand perfectionism is as a construct. What is it made of, and are there different parts to it? May there in fact be some parts that have more of a pernicious effect than other types of perfectionistic dimensions? And in particular, I want to focus a little bit in telling you about what we know about these different dimensions of perfectionism and how they correlate with mental health, because there are in fact some striking differences depending on which dimension or part of perfectionism you are examining in terms of the ways in which it's likely to impact or be related to your psychological well-being, or its opposite, having some symptoms of distress or psychopathology. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to inoculate against perfectionism's negative effects. So given, in fact, as I'll establish today, that there does seem to be this connection between certain parts of perfectionism and negative mental health outcomes, is there something we can do, some type of approach or strategy that might be useful to lessen that impact? So let me start first. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance the slide and it's not responding to me. There we go. With what is perfectionism? And I'm just going to try to advance it one more time to give you my definition. So this definition of perfectionism actually grew out of the work that I did as an undergraduate here at Smith College. And this is one of my first published articles, and one of the first published articles to examine perfectionism as a multidimensional construct. That is to contemplate the possibility that perfectionism is not in fact one thing. It's not a monolith, but rather has different parts and pieces, and that we need to basically disassemble the construct in order to get our best sense of how it relates to a person's well-being. So if you can pull up this definition here, what you will see is that there we go. That what we had written originally is that perfectionism involves high standards of performance which are accompanied by tendencies for overly critical evaluations of one's own behavior. The psychological problems associated with perfectionism are probably more closely associated with these critical evaluation tendencies than with the setting of excessively high standards. And this, I think, was an important development in the field because there was a lot of controversy and many different ideas about what perfectionism was. In fact, interestingly, if you think about the notion of perfectionism, there are different ways in which it's considered either a good or a bad thing. So, for example, the layperson's use of the term perfectionism often suggests that as a positive attribute, someone who is conscientious, who's a high achiever, someone on whom you can rely if this particular individual were a coworker or colleague in some way. And yet, on the other side of the coin is that in the clinical literature, there were a lot of case studies that were provided by clinicians who were seeing people riddled with perfectionistic worries presenting to them in therapy and talking about how this setting of high standards was not functioning in their lives as a positive thing, but rather as a very negative thing. And so, again, what psychologists have been struggling with over the years has been, how can it be both those things at once? And so this particular definition here, I think, highlights and it's one of the first definitions to highlight this, the fact that there are different pieces. So on the one hand are the high standards, and on the other hand are the critical evaluations of one's own behavior. And in fact, we hypothesized at that point in time that it was these critical evaluation tendencies, more than being an achievement driver, that actually predicted negative psychological outcomes. Now, since we published this definition, I'm just going to move forward and show you the next slide. In fact, there's been a real burgeoning of interest in understanding the construct of perfectionism. And in fact, we published that definition of perfectionism at the same time in the same paper in which we published a measure of perfectionism. So it was one of the first psychometrically validated measures for actually getting at and quantifying in some way a person's level of perfectionism. And our measure was called the multidimensional perfectionism scale because we wanted to put forth this idea that perfectionism may have different pieces and that separating those might be important. Interestingly enough, science often has these instances of serendipity. There's a group of very prolific perfectionism researchers who were also beginning this work at that time, and they're up in Canada, Hewitt and Flett. They published their measure of perfectionism also using a multidimensional approach, although slightly different from ours, in exactly the same year. And funnily enough, the name of their measure is also the multidimensional perfectionism scale. And in fact, apparently there was an interesting exchange about trying to claim the title, each research group for its own. And in fact, what happened was they were published almost at exactly the same time in different journals, both with the title of multidimensional perfectionism scale. And I think, to me, to some degree, that kind of replication of kind of insight suggests that we're on the right track. And since that time, in the early 1990s, when these two psychometrically validated measures of perfectionism were published, what's happened is countless studies have now tried to look at the construct and understand it, and figure out whether, in fact, perfectionism is multidimensional, and then how best to understand those dimensions, or whether it might be something more unidimensional. And study after study does in fact confirm that there appear to be two principal dimensions of the perfectionism construct. And so you see them here, one the yellow circle and the other the blue. And let me focus first on evaluative concerns, or what is included there as MEC, or maladaptive evaluative concerns. And this part of perfectionism is the piece that we had hypothesized might be most strongly related to psychopathology and emotional distress. And it includes features like a person who tends to worry consistently about making mistakes, or who tends to fear failure. A person who tends to doubt one's own actions, that is, never quite knowing whether something is done or good enough. These types of individuals who have these evaluative concerns also feel a great deal of pressure from others to be perfect. So it's not something that emanates from within, rather it's something that they feel other people are placing upon them. So they experience that as a burden, where a significant others, when we're talking about children, it might be teachers or parents. When we discuss adults, it might be a spouse, a significant other, a boss, or a colleague, is exerting significant pressure and an expectation that an individual with whom they're interacting would be perfect. The other side of the perfectionism construct is what many researchers called achievement striving, or positive achievement striving. And this is the part that I think probably matches best with what most lay people believe is this construct of perfectionism, which is a kind of trying to do one's best, a striving for high standards. I always tend to try my best or set very high goals for myself. And oftentimes what's interesting is this particular dimension tends to capture pressure from oneself to be perfect. So you're not necessarily experiencing that other people are expecting you to not make mistakes, or not to ever fail, but rather you put that own pressure on yourself to be perfect. And so what research has found repeatedly is that the perfectionism construct has lots of dimensions. So you see them all listed up there. The 5 different dimensions are listed along there: striving, worries about mistakes, doubts about one's own actions, pressures from others to be perfect, or pressures from self to be perfect. But we could probably best, most simply and elegantly understand perfectionism having 2 primary dimensions: this evaluative concerns piece and also the achievement striving piece. And so that's the way that I'm going to be talking about it for the rest of our time together today, is to try to distinguish those 2 things. And one of the things that I really like to point out when I'm talking about this notion of perfectionism is also how elusive it is as a goal and a construct. And so one of the insights that have come from not only this type of quantitative work, but also from clinicians who work in the field, are that people who are really riddled with significant perfectionism, and in particular these evaluative concerns, often find that perfectionism, they believe that it's possible, and yet they're never able to attain it. And so one of the interesting things in the clinical literature is that people who are perfectionistic don't ever recognize their own achievements or the goals that they've actually accomplished. So let me give you an example. A student, for example, at Smith, we have many of them who set very high standards for grades. And if this particular student was planning for the upcoming semester to set a goal of getting a 4.0, and worked really, really hard and actually achieved the 4.0. If that person was primarily an achievement striver who focused on striving for high standards and put pressure on themselves to try to be as perfect as they could possibly be, chances are they would likely view that 4.0 with a great deal of satisfaction and contentment, feeling like they set the standards and they had actually met them. If this was an individual who had this level of achievement striving but also had a great deal of evaluative concerns, that 4.0, even though it was their predetermined goal, would never quite feel good enough. So, for example, a real true perfectionist who had a lot of evaluative concerns might say something like, well, I got the 4.0, but not every one of my assignments was an A, and they discount their success that way. Or they might note something like, well, it's true that I got a 4.0, but this is the first semester I've ever gotten a 4.0, and so I'm not really all that smart. Or I got a 4.0, but Sally down the hall also got a 4.0, and I spend 60 hours a week in the library in order to achieve it, and I hardly saw her studying at all. So again, what they tend to do is to discount or to feel dissatisfaction even when they're feeling perfectionistic. And this is one of the paradoxes of perfectionism, is that people who are truly perfectionistic, especially those who have these evaluative concerns, actually never feel satisfied, even when they accomplish truly remarkable things. And so one of the lessons that I want to share with you about this literature in general, if we could move to the next slide, is basically that perfection is a myth. That oftentimes even people who are perfectionistic and are striving for and believing, relentlessly pursuing perfection, that even when they achieve it, and this is rare because most of us are imperfect and it's difficult to be perfect, even when they achieve that, it never provides the satisfaction that it should. And that's typically because of this evaluative concerns dimension. So what I want to talk a little bit about is what the liabilities are for having perfectionism. So if we get to the next slide, we're going to talk a bit about perfectionism's mental health correlates. One of the issues that often comes up with people who are truly perfectionistic, interestingly, is that they're afraid to some degree that if they somehow abandon their achievement striving or their worries about making mistakes, they're afraid that, in fact, they're going to end up being worthless. They're afraid that if, as a student, they were to give up on those goals and concerns, that, in fact, they may become a student who drops out or fails, or if they were a worker, that they wouldn't be up for a promotion in the future, etc. But what often perfectionists don't recognize is that there are costs associated with these this relentless pursuit of perfection, and that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about now. So there have been, at this point, if we can go to the next slide, there have been dozens and dozens of studies. At this point, I would hazard to say hundreds of studies that have looked at the predictive relationship between perfectionism's two dimensions and how that associates with mental health outcomes. When I began this research way back as an undergraduate in the late 80s and early 1990s, there weren't very many articles at all about perfectionism's mental health correlates. As I mentioned earlier, most of that were clinical case studies. There was an article here or there, but the body of literature had not really been very well developed, and that was likely associated with or related to the fact that there was no good measure for capturing a person's perfectionism level. Since the development of the two MPSs in the early 1990s, and since they've been published now, researchers have really been drawn to this area of the literature. So when I first started to study perfectionism, I kept all of the articles that mentioned it in one way or another in a 2-inch binder and carried it with me almost everywhere. At this point, I have file cabinets filled with articles from researchers who are examining these very important questions. And rather than go through each and every one of those studies, I'm just going to try to summarize them for you a little bit and make a point that it is really important to consider perfectionism's two dimensions separately. That's because if you actually read quickly what's on the slide, and I'll go through them with a little more detail, you'll see that they actually seem to have a very different set of relationships to a person's mental health. So first of all, evaluative concerns. I don't know that any of you would be particularly surprised given how I defined evaluative concerns earlier. Remember, these are worries about mistakes, being afraid of failure, doubting whether you're ever good enough or whether a job is ever well enough done, feeling pressure from others to be perfect. I don't know that anyone would be surprised to find out or discover that evaluative concerns, as far as I've seen in the published literature, has never once, even with all these dozens and dozens of studies, associated with or predicted any kind of positive mental health outcomes. In fact, the opposite is true. Evaluative concerns, a person's degree of that, the level that they have of evaluative concerns, tends to very robustly and consistently associate with the negative mental health outcomes. In fact, I would hazard that I don't know of a study that has actually not found that evaluative concerns is associated with signs of psychopathology and emotional distress. So that's a pretty consistent finding. I think there's a lot of agreement in the literature amongst the leading researcher, the leading perfectionism researchers and clinicians that evaluative concerns has significant costs in terms of emotional well-being. Achievement striving provides a little bit more of a conundrum. The data here are more confusing because there are occasions in which achievement striving associates with positive mental health outcomes, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in just a moment. But it also sometimes associates with negative mental health outcomes. So although earlier I was talking about evaluative concerns as being maladaptive, I think that's fairly true. I also then labeled achievement striving as being positive, and I think what's happened over the years is that researchers have been kind of puzzled by and worried about the fact that achievement striving can actually have a very conflicting relationship to different kinds of outcomes, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it seems to be associated with bad outcomes. Sometimes it's not associated at all. So researchers have been figuratively scratching their heads trying to understand this a little bit more. And I'm going to explain to you a bit about why that might be. But first I want to show you a picture of the different kind of relationships that evaluative concerns and achievement striving has with a person's well-being. So if we can advance to the next slide, I'm going to show you that same bidimensional model that I had just a few slides ago, evaluative concerns and achievement striving. And what I've done is I've put a list next to each bubble of those things that tend to be correlated or predicted by each of the separate dimensions. And you can see the quality of the list is really quite different. On the left-hand side, there are evaluative concerns, and evaluative concerns are robustly and consistently associated with all kinds of negative outcomes and all different forms of psychopathology, including anxiety, and within that category I count lots of different kinds of anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, worry, social anxiety, also related to depression, and if I might skip down the list a bit, go straight to suicidality, which is you know, a correlate of very severe and chronic hopeless depression is a person's risk for suicide. It's very strongly related to eating disorder symptoms and eating disorders. It's associated with sex dysfunction. And interestingly enough, these evaluative concerns, given that they're associated with all these negative outcomes, you might think would be ones that would bring people into therapy. And there have been some really fascinating studies that have been done that find that evaluative concerns actually predicts poorer response to treatment once people seek out some kind of therapy assistance. And this is particularly problematic, although I guess not so surprising given, again, that there's this worry about what other people might think about you, since it's associated, evaluative concerns is associated with social anxiety and worrying about mistakes and failures. But it is quite troublesome, because what it means is that when a person makes an effort to engage with a clinician, if they're riddled with these types of evaluative concerns, they're actually less likely to respond to the therapy itself. And in some of my own research, I've also found that people who have market evaluative concerns also tend to score very high in levels of self-concealment. That is, they're not likely to talk to other people about their mistakes or failure. They keep them very close. And in fact, part of that self-concealment can fuel the negative emotion state that a person has experienced. In fact, disclosure and seeking out social support can be an important way in which people learn to deal with times when they're feeling inadequate or when they've had a blow to their self-esteem. And so clearly these evaluative concerns have a real psychological cost. Now, if you look at the other side of the model at achievement striving, you tend to find lots of good things that achievement striving correlates with or predicts, including positive affect, feeling of self-efficacy, higher levels of self-esteem, greater motivation, and in some instances even higher achievement, for example, in a college course. So those are all the positive things I mentioned that achievement striving is sometimes related to. And there are occasions, however, and this is the kind of conundrum of perfectionism, there are occasions in which achievement striving is also found to be associated with eating disorder and depression and occasionally other forms of psychopathology. And what's interesting about this is that researchers have started to look even more fully and closely and using more sophisticated models to understand why achievement could be simultaneously both a good and a bad thing. And what they've actually found, and I've done some of this research myself, is that part of what may account for achievement striving's relationship with some of these negative outcomes is that there's something else going on in addition to the achievement striving. So, for example, if a person is an achievement striver or is high on achievement striving, and in addition, they're also someone who tends to experience or be high in levels of what's called contingent self-worth. That's when you have this sense that your self-worth is contingent upon your most recent performance or achievement or accolade, and that your basic sense of self is something that tends to be in flux as you're responding to whether the world is telling you that you're a good worker or a smart student or a great mother. That all of achievement striving interacts with contingent self-worth, and when it does, that's when a person tends to be at risk for more depressive symptoms, etc. So it's not that achievement striving is directly related, but when it's paired with other kinds of risks, it seems to be associated with these other forms of psychopathology. Another example that was done with the Canadian group Hewitt and Flett I mentioned not so long ago looked at longitudinally people who scored high in achievement striving and then followed up with a survey months later and asked them about experiences that they had in the interim. And they found that individuals who are high in achievement striving who also experienced some kind of failure event, so maybe it was not doing as well as you wanted in a class or having a breakup happen or something along those lines, that the achievement striving paired with the failure event predicted depression levels. But people who were achievement strivers who didn't experience any kind of failure event had no increase in level of psychopathology. So it seems that achievement striving can result in good outcomes, but there also is a risk, especially in interaction with other kinds of experiences and individual differences that could ultimately lead to various kinds of psychopathology. So this is something to keep in mind as you're thinking about people you know, or if you're doing a self-evaluation of how these two different dimensions might work for you or for a loved one, is that the second lesson I want to share, which is on the next slide, which is that basically if you're finding that thinking that yourself or a loved one has a high level of evaluative concerns, I think that at that point, given all of the tremendous research literature, that is cause for concern, because evaluative concerns do tend to exact costs in terms of people's well-being and happiness and satisfaction with life. And so sometimes people say to me, well, that may be true, but so what you're saying is achievement striving can sometimes be positive, so I shouldn't give up on trying to do my best, should I? And I think that what's interesting about that is that achievement striving has, in fact, for many people, led to very good places. Having career achievements, ending up at Smith College, graduating with honors, uh, becoming a good, caring, loving spouse or partner or mother, etc. But I think we need to recognize that there is a risk inherent in focusing too much on achievement striving, because there are occasions in which people do seem vulnerable to psychopathology when they tend to have very high levels of achievement striving, even if they don't particularly define themselves with evaluative concerns. So given that I've just kind of established or tried to make the argument that evaluative concerns exact costs them pretty, again, reliably and robustly, and that sometimes achievement striving can too, the question becomes, what do we do in response to that? How do we respond to our own children who may seem to be fearful of making mistakes, or a coworker who tends to be very sensitive to any kind of feedback in any way? Or even for yourself, if you feel like you tend to focus on your mistakes to the exclusion of all the good things that you've accomplished or done. So researchers have tried to talk a little bit about and think a little bit about how to inoculate against perfectionism's negative effects. So I want to tell you a little bit about some hints and tricks that I think might be useful, and this may be particularly helpful as we're going into what often tends to be for many people a very hectic season and time, because there seems to be much more to do for many people's holiday preparations. So let me tell you some tricks and hints for inoculating against perfectionism. Some of this is grounded in my own research and other individuals' research, and also some of it's just common sense. So if we can go to the next slide, I just wanted to show you how can we inoculate against perfectionism. So first of all, one of the things that I think is a really useful bit of advice is to embrace imperfection. Life is messy. And in fact, sometimes the things that are most worthwhile in life have embedded within them lots of opportunity for failure. And indeed, sometimes our failure experiences when we've lived life long enough are the ones that best define us as a human being. In fact, oftentimes we're proudest of the ways in which we have reacted or responded to a failure experience, and see it as a tremendous time of growth and learning. Now, of course, it doesn't feel as quite so positive as we're going through it or encountering it, but nonetheless, I think it's really important to think about embracing imperfection, about making mistakes, about trying things that are hard for us, taking risks, which is the next thing on the list, taking risks in an effort to grow and to challenge ourselves. And so this is often something that is really useful. I'm thinking about how in my own life as a mother, I try to embrace imperfection and talk about the times that I do things wrong for the kids, that I pick them up too late from school, or miss a performance because I had a conflict. And talking about how in life we just try the best we can, and that's what should be expected. That should be kind of the measure. It's not the performance itself, it's the process, and that's a point that I'll get to again in just a moment. In fact, I often tell my students and my children that if their focus is always on being perfect, they may be setting the bar fairly low for themselves. If what's most important to an individual is never making mistakes, then in fact they may try to play it safe, to avoid opportunities in which they're going to look less than masterful. And in fact, doesn't that mean that they're shutting themselves off or closing themselves off from lots of opportunity for growth and discovering new passions? I often tell students who are themselves kind of struggling to become good writers and good students and good thinkers that about my own struggles to get published or to write a paper. And I think that to them is really eye-opening, that even at this point in time, as someone who makes a living from trying to write well and talk well, etc., that I still find struggles, and that there are still reviewers who have negative things to say about me, and talk about how important it is to be persistent and to try to learn from those opportunities. So all of that leads me to the third bullet point, which is don't be praised perfect. And I think this one is a really important point to make, especially in the raising of children, but I think it's also true for anyone who is a boss or a wife or in relation to other individuals. And it's this idea of being praised perfect is one that has been reinforced by the work or created by the work of Carol Dweck and colleagues. She's a developmental psychologist who has actually looked at the ways in which kids respond to academic challenge. She's done really interesting laboratory research in which she's examined how kids respond to academic challenge when you praise them for being smart versus praising them for trying hard. And she's done a whole series of programmatic studies that have looked at how kids respond to academic challenges, solving puzzles or working on math problems, when the lab confederate says to them, wow, you did a really good job, you're a very smart boy, versus, wow, you did a really good job, you're a girl who tries really hard at these things. And what's interesting about her research, really fascinating and perhaps somewhat counterintuitive, is that children who you praise for being perfect because they're smart actually shy away from subsequent challenges. So if you say, Johnny, you did a great job, you must be a really smart boy, and then ask them, would you like to try a new challenge, they're actually more likely to say no. Then if you say, wow, Sally, you're a really smart girl, you tried really hard, how would you like to try these new ones? You actually find that the child's more likely to try a new challenge once you praise them for the process rather than the outcome. So I think this is a really important lesson to learn. In essence, I think what's happening here, and this is what Dweck hypothesizes, is that individuals don't want to disappoint. So once you label them as smart, competent, good worker, etc., things that are fairly consistent or persistent labels, they don't want to provide you evidence to the contrary. So they're less likely to want to actually embrace a challenge because there's a likelihood for you to have evidence that, in fact, they're not as smart as you originally thought. Whereas if you praise them for the work that they put in, there's no risk to them trying a new challenge, because if they try their hardest, then in fact that praise would be likely to persist and your evaluation of them wouldn't be impacted or affected. So I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind. Some other things, understanding and addressing perfectionism's risks. I think I said just a moment ago, I've mentioned a couple in my talk today. Self-concealment, responses to failure experiences, contingent self-worth. These are variables that often interact, especially with achievement striving, but can also with evaluative concerns to increase risk for psychopathology. So these also require some attention in addition, so whether through self-help or through clinicians' help, making sure that you're not being hard on yourself, that you don't tend to self-conceal, but rather you disclose when you perceive a defect or weakness, that you're working to develop a more stable sense of self that doesn't actually respond and change given the vagaries of the latest feedback of the day. And so that's another important area of, I think, inoculating against perfectionism. Reframing dysfunctional cognitions is another piece of the work that I've done. And so in a lab study with some of my students, we've actually found that if you can help students to reframe their dysfunctional cognitions prior to giving a public speech in front of a small audience, that they actually report significantly decreased anxiety and response. And so how exactly do you reframe? What exactly do you do? Well, most of it focuses on examining evidence, so kind of objectively evaluating a person's dysfunctional cognition. So in this public speaking example, where students are often imagining the worst, that the audience will laugh or they'll totally lose their place, they won't have a thing to say. we reframe that by having them look at the evidence. How many times have they given a talk where they've forgotten what to say, etc., had the whole audience laughing at them? And then we have them think about, okay, even if that were to happen, how terrible would that really be in the grand scheme of life? And these types of approaches to dysfunctional or negative cognitions, in the literature, it's called decatastrophizing and addressing probability overestimations, that these kinds of cognitive approaches are the basis of cognitive therapy, and it seems to be helpful for perfectionism's dysfunctional cognitions as well. And lastly, another important point for inoculating is fostering protective factors. So that is trying to think about ways in which we can create environments that decrease this likelihood of being afraid of mistakes, etc. So that would include all of the above, embracing imperfection, modeling the taking of risks, praising someone's efforts rather than their outcomes, etc. So just a couple of more lessons, I think, that I'd just like to share at this point. This is the next slide. Is lesson number 3. Oh, I just passed that. Is to be kind. Be kind to oneself and to others, recognizing that best efforts are, in fact, that they should be the yardstick by which we measure accomplishments. Taking risks and enjoying the process rather than always being focused on the outcome. And I just want to move toward the conclusion by sharing with you a quote from Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anna Quindlen, an alum of a women's college, not surprisingly, who herself in her book Being Perfect, which is actually the commencement address that she provided, a commencement address she provided to Barnard not so long ago, and disclosed her own struggles with being perfectionistic. Here's a quote that I think is really quite lovely and is probably the take-home message here, which is, look every day at the choices you are making, and when you ask yourself why you're making them, find this answer: because they are what I want or wish for, because they reflect who and what I am. So rather than focus on this being perfect, it's feeling driven by passion and engagement and interest. So just to sum up, move to the last slide. So when is perfectionism no good at all, which is the title of my talk to begin with? All the time with these maladaptive evaluative concerns, right? So that again, it seems that these evaluative concerns are very reliably related with all kinds of psychopathological outcomes and increased level of symptoms. But no, even if that's true, even when that's true, that inoculation and intervention is possible by approaching the evaluative concerns from using some of the strategies and tips that I provided. In addition, a therapist of some kind can also be extraordinarily helpful with that inoculation and developing and kind of honing those kinds of skills. And then lastly, that positive achievement striving carries some risk, right? There are instances in which it interacts with other pre-existing risks or environmental risks and can lead to negative outcomes. But that in many ways, achievement striving in and of itself can actually be a good personality characteristic to have, because it can be adaptive in many ways, increasing the likelihood that someone will have good self-esteem, high achievement, and good motivation. And with that, I think we are just about ready to take questions.
We are, Patty. This is Amy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions that people have asked, one from very early on in the session. Please explain how these concepts relate to work such as editing and proofreading, where accuracy is the point. No one wants to see a mistake in his or her book.
That's a great question. In fact, I often get people asking me that very question, not always about editing and proofing, but often where precision is in fact a highly valued part of a person's work product. So I've had surgeons ask me this question, and editors and whatnot. And I think that there needs to be some clear recognition that precision and carefully looking for as many mistakes as possible is really important and valued. And I don't want it to sound as if I'm devaluing that. In fact, when I say embrace imperfection, I don't know that that would be on the next manuscript that you should say, well, let me just see how it feels to get this published with lots and lots of mistakes in it. But rather, I think what I would instead suggest is that people recognize that mistakes are inevitable and that you put safeguards in place when work really does need to be mistake-free and of high quality, that you put safeguards in place to make sure that as much as is humanly possible that the mistakes don't slide through, but with the recognition that they will on occasion, even with these safeguards in place. And to not feel as if that one little mistake has ruined the whole entire book or ruined the whole entire process in some way. And I think that's probably most important. Also, people who are very perfectionistic tend to have what's called black and white thinking, which is that there is this, it's like dropping ink into a bucket of water. It's that once there's one mistake, the whole entire thing is a failure. It's absolutely ruined. And so nothing can be less than perfection, that if it's not perfect, it's a failure. And if you can imagine a person who judges him or herself, his work product, his qualities as a parent, as a spouse, etc., by that standard, you can imagine that at every turn they're just going to be wildly disappointed and feel wholly inadequate. And so I think my sense is basically to put safeguards in place when precision is important. Recognizing that mistakes, however, are inevitable, and when mistakes do happen, as they inevitably will, to try to put them in perspective. So rather than using this black and white thinking for viewing them, to think more fully about how it was a mistake in the context of a bigger body of work.
Okay, thank you. I am on. Okay. The next question is a little long one, but it's very interesting. What are the effective ways to deal with a parent who imposes perfectionism on his or her child, including college age? That is, to the parent, a 4.0 isn't good enough or raises even higher expectations. In this situation, external pressure is imposed even if the child or the student also demonstrates achievement striving. What are the ways to break through that kind of ultimately negative external expectation?
Oh, these are good questions. That's a really, really tough one. Well, it sounds like the person who posed the question has an appreciation that there are times in which individuals feel that they're carrying a tremendous burden because others expect them to be perfect or better than perfect, right? I mean, getting a 401 semester is in itself a very laudable goal, but you're exactly right that in certain instances, once that's established as a baseline, then it's, well, you need to get a Fulbright, you need to get into medical school, you need to get the most competitive residencies. In fact, this is what I was saying about kind of the greediness of perfectionism, that it never really goes away. Once you achieve a certain bar, if a person's truly perfectionistic, whether a parent or even in viewing one's own accomplishments, that that'll never feel like enough. So once you've achieved a bar, then a new bar will be raised. So you may not be surprised to know that I have students who are really struggling with that, that I advise or have in my classes, etc. It's not that they themselves are unhappy with the grade, but rather they're afraid of what a parent or someone else might think about that. And I spend a lot of time talking with my students about trying to develop their own motivations for goal setting and thinking a little bit about what makes them happy, and talking about really enjoying and embracing the process of whatever it is they're doing or learning, because I think that is, in my experience in watching people, as well as looking at the research on perfectionism, people who are happiest, who can sustain engagement professionally or personally over long periods of time, are those individuals who have cultivated passion and interest in a particular area. So I've watched students who have worked really hard and gotten into very competitive graduate schools and have dropped out in the first semester, not because they're not smart enough, but because they weren't there because they wanted to be. Someone else wanted them to be there. And so I often share that with my students when they're talking about this pressure to follow a certain path, to say that it might work for you for a short period of time, but in the long run, you're going to need to develop your own internal sense of what it is you love and want to do, because you'll only be able to kind of live by, you know, other people's yardsticks of your measure or worth for only so long before you'll collapse under the pressure of that. So I often try to explain that to students. Now, that's good advice, but actually putting that into play is very difficult and challenging, I think, and does require a lot of open communication with family members or significant others about the fact that they're experiencing negative pressure to be perfect. And I think those are hard conversations to have, but for me, I think they're pretty healthy ones.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, the next question is from Teresa. She's a high school math teacher and wonders whether there are inoculations that are most appropriate for late adolescent students. You may have answered some of this already, but that's the question.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, you know, some of Carol Dweck's research that I was talking to you earlier was really focused on younger kids, but was very interested in education. And I think that, you know, all the ones that I've mentioned, the looking at perfectionism risks and dysfunctional cognitions and trying to reframe them, are ones that we've actually tested here on some Smith students, so I think would work really well for an educator who tends to teach late adolescents. So I think that it's about, you know, trying to cultivate as much as possible this internal sense of I'm a student pursuing things that they find interesting or intrinsically motivating in some way, and then trying to put aside all the other messages and information from outside themselves that said that they can't or shouldn't or aren't good enough, etc. And I think that's the basic message that I would probably provide to students at that age.
Okay. The next question has to do with, I'm sorry, I was answering another question. You mentioned that there are strategies to deal with MEC. Then why is it that people who look for help, who go to clinicians because they recognize they're struggling, do not respond so well to treatments?
How come, I'm sorry, the people do not respond well to the treatments? Well, here's the data. The data is slightly complicated. I said in general that people who are high in evaluative concerns tend to have poor prognosis in relation to therapy, and that is true. But researchers have also looked to see if that's true for absolutely everyone who goes to therapy or not, because clearly that would be disconcerting if it's true that every individual who comes in with significant evaluative concerns tends to respond poorly in therapy. Then clearly we shouldn't be recommending that they spend any money on therapy if it's not going to be helpful for them. So researchers have started to try to understand that response a little bit better. So although as a group they tend not to respond to therapy, there are ways in which certain therapist behaviors or certain therapy relationship variables can predict better outcomes. So let me give you an example. If the relationship between the patient or client and the therapist is a good one, that is, if it's rated as one where there's what's called a good therapeutic alliance, where both members of the duo feel like they're working together, they have shared goals, and that they're working productively on problems, then individuals, even when they have marked maladaptive evaluative concerns, do tend to do better in therapy. So I think it's even more crucial to have a really good and connected relationship to a therapist if you feel like you have high levels of evaluative concerns. And to me that makes good sense if in fact you're worried about making mistakes or being a failure, and if your relationship with your therapist is not a great one, you might actually be very worried about what your therapist thinks about you. Am I working hard enough? Am I progressing as much as I should, etc. So I think that finding and connecting with a good therapist is probably even more important. The other part of it is that people in therapy, I mean, the therapist is one useful relationship for working out kind of your pattern of interacting with the world, right, and learning skills for doing that. But there was another study that was done out of Yale that found that individuals who sought out and actually cultivated higher levels of social support outside of the therapy session, even when they had high levels of evaluative concerns, also tended to respond better to therapy. So in essence, it's, the therapist is just one relationship that can help someone to deal with their evaluative concerns, but whether people were also connecting to other social supports and had available other social supports was even a better predictor of whether they responded to therapy or not. And I think part of therapy often is trying to help you to figure out how you can cultivate and create those kinds of useful and productive and affirming relationships. And so those are two things I would say, having a strong therapeutic alliance, so really connecting with and liking your therapist I think is especially important. And also just thinking of the therapist as being one way in which you can kind of attack or approach the problem, and thinking much more broadly about finding other social supports as well that can help you to address or confront your evaluative concerns is also another important piece.
Great. Okay, we have about 6 minutes left, and I have just a couple more questions. The next one, what are tips for inoculating against perfectionism within the context of a spouse/significant other relationship, especially if two people both have perfectionist tendencies and one party is considerably more reflective than the other?
Very interesting. Well, interestingly, in graduate school, I did a little bit of research while I was a student on looking at the relationship. I mentioned earlier there's a connection between evaluative concerns and sex dysfunction. And in fact, in a research study that I did when I was a graduate student, we found that wives' perfectionism scores predicted the husband's sex dysfunction. So in essence, although we're labeling the husband as having the sex dysfunction in this particular instance, he was presenting to a clinic because he had difficulties with his sexual functioning. We actually found that his perfectionism level didn't in fact predict his problem as much as the wife's perfectionism level did. So we do need to understand this perfectionism, especially as part often of a system, right, or interconnected relationships. So we already had a question about parents, we had a question from a teacher, and now we're talking about it from a spousal perspective, right? So sometimes it doesn't matter if you yourself want to try to have the healthiest approach to thinking about achievement and responsibility if in fact you're closely connected to and have a relationship with someone who has more exacting standards or tends to be more critical. And so I'm not sure exactly how to approach that. I think it's similar to what I said earlier, which is opening up the lines of communication and talking about how the ways in which certain kinds of responses to imperfection impact a person. I tend, when you are critical of a small error or oversight that I made, I tend to feel like I'm not allowed to make any mistakes, otherwise you're mad at me. And so I think that it might be worthwhile to have that kind of conversation. I think you're right that people have different levels of kind of psychological mindedness, and some people are pretty in touch with their own psychology and also what they need from other people, and others not so much. And so that may even be the starting point for having a conversation, which may be that my perception is that that you tend to be perfection, or that my perception is that oftentimes you tend to be pretty exacting in your standards, right, owning your own feelings, and that has a negative impact on me, and I'm wondering, how can we think about that? What can we do about it? Are there ways in which I do the same to you? Can we kind of put this on the table in our relationship? Yeah, I mean, anyone who's part of a relationship, especially a long-standing one, knows that imperfections and hurt feelings and resentments are going to happen over and over again. It's that process of kind of growth and communication and trying to I think develop ways of coping together that's really important, and I might recommend that if that's hard to do individually, that maybe someone else, like a good therapist in the room, could be potentially helpful. But yes, I mean, I think these are hard conversations to have, and they often can lead to this increased evaluative concerns, because remember, again, one of the hallmarks of that is when you're feeling like other people are pressuring you to never make a mistake.
Sure, sure. Okay, we have 2 more questions, and they both actually could get a little complex, I think. So if we aren't able to get to the questions, I will definitely forward them to Patty. And Patty, if you don't mind responding directly to the questioner, that would be great.
Sure.
I'll throw one out.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a correlation between perfectionism and low achievement, quote unquote,
Mm.
lowering the bar, becoming stuck or paralyzed, or is that included in negative mental health?
Well, yeah, so I wasn't so explicit about that, but there absolutely is a connection. In fact, there is a relationship between perfectionism and procrastination. And in fact, I've had a number of students in my office who have had difficulty completing my coursework and or my course, and sometimes even dropping out of Smith College because they were perfectionistic. So, you know, they've come to see me to say they just can't get pen to paper or fingers on keyboard because they've been writing the same paragraph over and over again because it's never good enough. And because of that, you look at them and you think, well, this isn't a perfectionistic presentation. They're not handing anything in. They're going to be failing your course. They're potentially going to be dropping out. But for me, it's very much tied to kind of the extreme, that sometimes these perfectionistic standards can create paralysis. And then they look like the opposite of what they're really expressing, right? The topology is that you know, and on a superficial level, is that they don't seem to care very much about the grades that they're getting, et cetera. But in fact, all that is driven by a deep-seated fear of mistakes and this idea that nothing less than perfect is acceptable.
Great. Thank you. Well, we've run out of time, and we do have just a couple more questions, so I will forward those to Patty and have her respond directly. So thanks again to Patty.
Thank you.
And to all our participants. We'll be sending the slides as a PDF to all the participants later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. And again, keep an eye open for future webinars, and the warmest